healing of the soul, I'll also identify with my spiritual name, Teoshpai wo Apia. And that way, all of the ancestors that are here recognize me and the words and all that's happening here. As I was listening to all the relatives this morning, I thought, this is a pretty incredible story of survival. And over the many years that I've been doing work as a clinical psychologist in Indian country, I've heard a lot of these stories a lot, and I tell people don't come to me usually to tell me how wonderful their life has been. Usually it's to tell me the terrible things that have happened. And during that time, I was able to learn a little bit about what's going on. And I was very fortunate during my training as a psychologist that I also had a native teacher that took me aside. And it's through those teachings that I was able to get a little bit of a glimpse into some of the natural law and some of the mystery that underlines all the things that we're talking about. And I'm really surprised to be here, because as of last Saturday evening, I didn't even know I was going to be here. And I was called, and here I am. And for forgiveness, that's not something that comes easy to me or to most human beings, I don't think. And as I was kind of contemplating on the meaning of that, one of the first things that came to mind is something that a very powerful medicine man said about 2,500 years ago. And his name is Yeshua, and most of you know him as Jesus Christ. And he taught his followers to forgive trespasses as we are forgiven. And I thought, as many times as that prayer has gone through all levels of our culture in the world, it really is real. It was really meant to be taken literally. And so to forgive, and what does that actually mean? But first I want to talk a little bit about this word trauma. And early on, when I first started doing my work, and it was actually in Central Valley, California, as a graduate student, and my assignment was to develop a needs assessment for the particular tribes that I was working with. And I started doing that, accumulating all this data as to what's wrong and what's ailing the communities. And when I started kind of writing this stuff up, some of the older people in the community took me aside and they said, well, none of that is real, none of that is true. And at that time I thought, well, there must be a real denial system in this community, because I could see with my own eyes that there was a lot of problems. And it's the usual problems that Brother Don and other people have mentioned this morning, the problems of violence, anger, alcoholism, suicidality, and the physical problems, the diabetes, and all of that. And so I asked the most, usually I do my work by just asking the simplest questions that I can ask. And most of the time it's either why or what is the problem. And at that time they said some words that were really didn't mean a whole lot to me, because they're not in the mainstream of psychological thinking. And they said, our problem is that our soul has been wounded. And other people say our spirit has been wounded, and that is the problem here. And of course, going into the psychological literature and all of that, and realizing that the word soul and spirit really doesn't exist within the context of the Western medical models of healing. And Also, what is really interesting is that most Native people are stuck in having to utilize those models of healing, the Western medical model. And so there's a real misfit. You know, the situation just doesn't fit. And as I was hearing about the boarding school, the chopping off the fingers, that really grabs the heart. And one of the first instincts in the human heart is to react to that. And a lot of times the reaction is we get upset and angry, and a lot of times that sticks to us. But as I was seeing the pictures of our youngsters there at the boarding school, there's already several levels of trauma that they were carrying with them. And this is one of the crucial things that I hope you know, I can leave with you today, is that we have found, you know, and this has actually been researched now by researchers, so now that empirical studies have been done, people believe it's real. We knew it was real before the studies were done. And what historical trauma or soul wounding teaches us is that when you're wounded, when you're hurt, if you don't heal that wound or that hurt, it stays, and that makes sense. But the other part of the equation is that it gets passed on to the next generation if you don't take care of it. And not only that, then it also becomes cumulative. And so by the time that these little kids were going to Carlisle, they probably already had 3 or 4 levels of historical trauma that they were carrying with them into the boarding school. And so then you add another horrific wounding to the process, and you can see, you know, what an impact this is going to have. And this was actually studied, where this was originally found out was by some Israeli psychiatrists who were treating Israeli children, and they found that a lot of them were being diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. And a lot of these children had never been to war, had never been traumatized, and they were wondering, well, how come they're exhibiting the symptoms? And so what they did is they went up the generations, and they saw that their grandparents or great-grandparents were traumatized, and so the children were then carrying the symptoms of the trauma. And also one of the teachings that most of the tribes, probably all over the world, have is that whatever we do, like what we're doing today, usually impacts at least 7 generations. So what's happening here today is going to impact 7 generations into the future. But then later I was taught that since time really doesn't have to be linear the way that most people think, that the 7 generations can also go before us. So we're also impacting 7 generations of ancestors today by being here. And that becomes a very powerful moment. And in working with Native people in kind of clinical settings, a lot of times that is the one thing that really, really sticks. That's the one thing that really, really makes it important as to the healing process. And it makes it really powerful that we're here today to practice this entity called forgiveness. Because once that happens here, it's going to release a tremendous amount of ancestors, as well as unborn ones that we'll never see with these eyes, but they're in the future. And one of the other teachings that has really been very powerful to me is the teachings of Viktor Frankl, who after losing his family and all his relatives in a concentration camp in Auschwitz, he was able to forgive. And when I first heard that, I thought, well, that's just not possible, because how do you do that? And one of the things that he said is that to understand is to forgive. So then the task to me became, well, I really need to understand as much as I can about this so that way forgiveness can happen at a real deep level. And I still maintain, though, that the real forgiveness comes from Creator. As human beings, at least speaking for myself, I'm way too pitiful to be really able to forgive some of the atrocities that happen. All I can actually do is try to open my heart and allow that forgiveness to flow through. And then I think that it'll become real. Part of the understanding in this is that the people that did these things, they also had historical trauma. And I'm not saying this to excuse anybody from anything, because everybody has spiritual responsibilities for everything they do. And but to be able to understand, to literally get inside their heart, and like this person that took the knife and chopped the little girl's finger, where did that come from? We could say, well, he's an evil guy, or he's no good for nothing, or you know, there's all kinds of ways of diagnosing the problem. But to me, you know, I really want to know why can somebody do that? Because psychologically, it just doesn't make any sense. There's no way that we can comprehend somebody taking an innocent person and doing that to them. And as you all know, the story of Columbus, when he decided to move in this direction, the people that he came with were people that were really traumatized, because what they did is they emptied the prisons and put all the murderers, child molesters, anybody who was not a very good person, they put them on those ships with them. And so coming across and Columbus himself, some scholars believe that he was also part Jewish, and he himself was fleeing the Inquisition. So he was traumatized himself at many different levels. So here comes these 3 boats across the ocean. And also when I talk about soul wounding and trauma, I'm not talking about it in a psychological context. It's really important that we see it as an actual spiritual entity. And so it's an actual energy that is moving. And so all of these guys, and they were all guys on these boats, were coming, and they're all possessed with this entity called trauma. They had been hurt in one way or another. And they had been hurt, some of them, for several generations. So some of them brought the spirit of historical trauma right on their person, right here to the shores of Turtle Island. And another level of the understanding is that most of the tribes here on Turtle Island were matrilineal, and so the spirit of the feminine was very strong. And so here comes all of these men who are very, very dysfunctional and very wounded. And basically what happened upon contact with this very dysfunctional masculine energy is that there occurred a literal rape of Turtle Island. And so not only were the human beings raped and abused by these people, the earth herself also suffered a huge insult. And it's really important that when we talk about healing and forgiveness, that we put the earth into the equation, because we are all earth. Every person on the planet, regardless of where you come from, we are earth in this body itself. And so we carry the memories of the earth. And so the earth, probably right on this very land that we're at, remembers what happened here. And we really, really need to pay homage to that. And that's why this hoop has been going and literally walking on the earth herself, because the earth herself needs to be brought back into harmony. And once we do that, then everything that comes from the earth will be in harmony. So we can't just heal this earth and separate from this earth. And that's one of the most difficult things, I think, for a lot of Western people, is that there's been a separation in consciousness from the earth herself. And that's why it makes it possible to abuse the earth, and we continue to do that at an alarming rate, to at some point the earth might decide to just shut down, and then none of us will be here. And so the soul of the earth herself has been wounded. And whenever things happen to these innocent ones, like at Carlisle, at the very moment that that little girl's finger was chopped off, the earth herself reacted to that, because it's such a tremendously horrible, evil act that it's not done just to the human being, it's done to all the cosmology and to God himself or herself, however you perceive that. And so that's why the forgiveness that we're talking about today becomes even more profound, and it's very difficult for me to even begin to comprehend that with this mind, because it becomes of an infinite nature, and this is where faith and the opening of the heart, I think, can really help us. When this soul wounding happens, and in working with a lot of individual people and families and communities, it is never an action that only impacts one part of the personality. So when a human being gets the intent to harm someone, that intent has spiritual energy to it, because it's a thought, that takes on spiritual quality, and then it takes a physical being to carry out that hurt. And because of that, then it becomes an act of sorcery, I believe, and it puts it on a spiritual level. So, because when we start talking about PTSD, that is really clinical, and it's real easy to just say the words, PTSD, the person was traumatized. But when we start talking about soul wounding and sorcery, that has a different meaning to most people, even people that think that what I just said is totally insane. The fact that it makes you think that it's totally insane means I'm getting a different reaction from you than if I were to say, well, Native people have historical trauma, and this is a PTSD, and this is what it says in the clinical literature, and then it's real easy to just wash it away. And by the way, that's one of the things that is happening to our vets here recently, as I read about some of the things that are happening, the suicide rates and the illnesses that they're getting cannot be explained by simple trauma psychology. It can only be explained by these spiritual notions that I'm talking about. And then Brother Don talked about natural law, and that's also what I'm talking about. And the natural law, real basically, isn't up to us to determine what it is. It's what it is. Like if I let go of this pen, it'll fall, because that's the way things are. There's nothing I can do to theorize. There's no law I can pass, or no clinical theory that I can devise to make it any different. And so I think that we need to realize that these things, the passing on of trauma, is real. And it's actually in the Old Testament, way back when, 6,000 or 7,000 years ago, when our Jewish relatives were out in the desert, it says in there that, and I don't remember exactly who said it, but that the sins of the father will be passed on to second, third, fourth generation. So already 6,000 and 7,000 years ago, people knew about historical trauma. They knew that if something happened to the ancestors, that the descendants of the ancestors would also be receiving, you know, some of the effects of that trauma. And another image that I'd like to leave with you today is that the secrecy. And the secrecy comes out of the mythology of the vampire. And in doing clinical work all these years, one of the images that especially severely traumatized children, especially if they're sexually abused, one of the images that seems to become part of their person is the image of the vampire. In a way, this kind of was discovered. I was supervising an intern years ago where he was supposed to be treating a young boy who'd been very badly abused. And every week, for several weeks, all the boy would do is draw him a picture of a vampire. And he wouldn't talk, he wouldn't say anything, and he would draw pictures of vampires over and over. And after about the 6th or 7th week, since I was the clinical supervisor, I said, well, I need to know what this means, but I had no idea what it meant. And so what I did is I assigned him and says, why don't you go find out everything you can about vampires? Because I really don't know, except what I watch on television, and it's not a lot of vampire stuff. And one of the, there's a paradigm, there's a vampire rules or code of conduct, I guess you might say. And the code of conduct for this myth is that vampires can only operate at night. So that's out of the light of day. So there's a secrecy. And it takes a very, very special, and it's only in a sacred way that you can get rid of vampire energy. So you could shoot a vampire with the best bullets that you have, it won't do anything. It has to be a bullet that's sacred, blessed by a sacred person. And then the energy can be removed. And the one that was really, really frightening is that the mythology of the vampire says that once you are bitten by a vampire, you yourself are doomed to become a vampire. And unless very sacred means are put into effect. And so the people that arrived here from Europe on Turtle Island were already bitten by vampire. So they brought vampire poison in their systems. So everything they touched then became abused by this energy, by this evil energy, for lack of a better word. And so what happens is that usually the victim, when you're shot with this energy, and I'm using these terms on purpose because these are very ancient terms that mean something to Native people, especially Native people who are still in understanding of the shamanic tradition. Because one of the ways to impart illness was to literally shoot the illness into the victim. And again, it takes the intent, and then the victim is shot. And this immediately triggers shame, guilt, and pain in the victim that is internalized. It's at that moment that the trauma or the energy is shot into him. Is in between that breath that the energy goes in and resides and takes a life of its own. The Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung said that these energies, he called them complexes, because at the time he couldn't use the word spirit because then people would have thought he was crazy, so he called them complexes. He says once they're in the unconscious, in this other side of the personality, if they're not dealt with, then they develop a life of their own, and they will then proceed to give all kinds of symptoms to the victim. And the interesting part of the symptoms is that this is built right into the trauma itself, this is part of the healing process. So the symptoms is basically a creator's way of trying to bring our attention that something is wrong. So if we start getting depressed, if we start abusing substances, or whatever it is that we're doing, this is basically Spirit's way of saying you need to deal with something underneath all of this. And this also can infect a whole family, infect a whole community, and infect nations. And we see the results of that. All you got to do is turn on the news, the CNN, and all they show is these terrible things happening all over the world. And somewhere behind in history, every one of those terrible things that is happening, there's a spirit of some type of vampire energy that bit somebody several generations ago, and now they're reacting to that energy. When we internalize this soul wounding, it's usually manifested either outside or inside. And with a lot of Native people, the way that we have dealt with a lot of this is by internalizing this energy. And a lot of people that I've known, that I've worked with, have become very self-destructive. So now there's these complexes, these energies that are inside them, and what they want is they want their life. Because remember, these are spiritual entities, and spirit only wants spirit, and they won't settle for anything else. And because of that, it'll take a spiritual means, just like in getting rid of a vampire, to be able to make it better. And that's why we're here today in this sacred hall, is to allow some of that spiritual energy of forgiveness and loving kindness to be able to do that. But how do you, and this is really hard to wrap my head around this, Captain Pratt, who was one of the gentlemen who started the boarding schools, and if you were standing right here, which he probably is in spirit form, how do you go about forgiving him for that? General Sheridan, who is another person very prominent in the soul wounding of Native people, General Sheridan, his prescription for getting rid of Native people was destroy their commissary. Commissary is the military word for food. So you destroy their food, and you don't have to worry about the so-called Indian problem. Andrew Jackson, who actually was president just down the block from here, and the things that he did to Native people, the Trail of Tears. How do you forgive an Andrew Jackson if you're sitting on that bench over there and not asking for forgiveness, but how do you forgive him anyway? And I really believe that Viktor Frankl's prescription is the only way that a human being could do that. And with like Andrew Jackson, for example, all we got to do is follow his lineage. And in his lineage, he was Irish. And you don't have to go too far back to know that the Irish were also targeted for genocide by another group of people in Europe. So by the time Andrew Jackson's family came here to these shores, they brought with them several generations of trauma. And one of the ways that I talk about this is I call it wounding seeks wounding. So if you're wounded, then you're going to be looking to wound somebody, because again, the wounding itself is a spiritual entity. Remember, when somebody hurts you, there's a different spirit that's put into you, and now it's the spirit of trauma. And so now natural law says, well, if that's what you are, that's what you're going to be looking for. So the wounding energy that you've taken on is looking to wound other people, and it moves on. And presently, the that's one of the big issues in Indian country, is that we're either internalizing the wounding and we hurt ourselves with all types of addictions. Suicide rates are still very high in certain parts of a native country, and that's when it goes inward. When it goes outward, usually it's projected out to people who look as much like us as possible. And most of the violence in Indian country is towards other native people, because we're trying to hurt ourselves by hurting someone that looks that is as close to us as possible, and that, you know, needs to be really looked at and studied, and it takes a real discipline to do this, because it's real easy to say, well, okay, I forgive him, and I've done that myself with all different types of events in my life. But when we really start looking real deeply, like Brother Don says, then a part of you is still wanting something. And that's why it's so important, the forgiveness that is being offered here and through this journey, is that it's unconditional. Because if we were to sit here and say, well, I want the United States government to prove to me and give me X, Y, Z, then we're still attached. And the only way to really forgive is to let go. But that's real simple, but not easy. And my teacher, over the 3 years that I knew him, over and over, that's the one thing he would tell me almost every time I would go see him. And this was back in the 80s. And only recently have I begun to learn what he meant by that very simple phrase, just let it go. And it would just be coming from the heart. And I said, well, let go of what? And letting go of these energies. Because as long as we hold on to the grief and then the anger that comes with the grief, and the self-righteousness and the pity, what that does is that blocks the way for anything else good to come through. And this is one of the things that one of the insights that came to me here recently. And the poisoning, again using the vampire image, the pain of the poisoning then goes in circles, because now you're poisoned, now you're angry, you're ashamed, you're full of guilt, so that creates a symptom. So now that symptom, that pain of that symptom, is another wounding. So now you have more shame and guilt because now you're hurting about something else. So then that cycle starts all over again. Now you have more shame, more guilt, and then pretty soon you are really in bad shape. And in talking to a lot of my relatives over the years, in whether it's in hospital settings or outpatient settings, a lot of them have tremendous amounts of body illnesses. And a lot of these body illnesses, come from the mind and spirit. And one of the most prevalent ones is diabetes. And the reason it's important to talk about that one is that 3 or 4 generations ago, diabetes was almost non-existent in Indian country. And now, all of a sudden, because 3 or 4 generations isn't that long, it is very prevalent. And there are some very small tribes out in the middle of the deserts. And I'll never forget visiting this one. Not a lot of people there, but they had their own shop where they would manufacture prosthesis limbs, because that's how many body parts the native people of the tribe were losing, to where they had to have their own factory right there on the reservation so that they could manufacture arms and legs and that sort of thing. And again, why is that? Why do we need that? If we didn't need that body part shop 100 years ago, why do we need it all of a sudden? So what happened? And what happened are the things that we're talking about here today. And the reason that a lot of times we sacrifice without knowing is that, again, natural law. When something is transgressed, when something wrong happens, natural law says something has to happen to make it right. And when it has to do with the kinds of insults that we're talking about here at that level, usually those sacrifices then require a blood sacrifice of some sort. And I strongly believe that a lot of the sacrifices that our native people make through the loss of body parts, through the loss of liver because of alcoholism, through all the sicknesses that diabetes has, is because of the shame and the guilt and the anger that we've internalized for something that was done to us in the first place. So it's not even our fault, yet we're paying the price for the perpetrator. And so it develops a real kind of backwards psychology there. And the one that really should be feeling that is not. And ideally, it would be good to have the perpetrator also as part of the healing process. But as I've told a lot of the patients that I've seen over the years who've been abused and traumatized, is that we can heal. You can heal yourself even if the perpetrator does not come forth, if they don't apologize, or if they continue doing whatever it is they're doing. That doesn't mean you can't heal. And in a way, spiritually though, by healing ourselves, then we're also helping the perpetrator. And this becomes a real profound act of love, which is the very ability that this trauma was taken away from a lot of Native people, is the ability to love. And most religious traditions, spiritual traditions, believe that love itself is creator, him or herself. So when you talk about the purest form of love, you're talking about God. And so the ability to enact God then is manifest again. And this is where the English language really doesn't do it justice, because it objectifies everything. And so when I say, well, God, well, it kind of makes it an object out here somewhere. In most tribal languages, from what I understand from all over the world, the languages are verb-based. They're not noun-based. So it doesn't objectify things. And so instead of saying God, for instance, they'll say Godding, which makes it a moving process, because Godding is God in movement. And that's a big step for Western English to make the leap. But it really is a process. And instead of saying I am a human being, I would say humaning is happening, which is a totally different way of looking at the world than seeing in objects. And once you objectify things, then it makes it possible to objectify a little girl and do terrible things to her, because now she's an object and she's not part of you any longer. If you were to be able to think of everyone as connected to you, it would be impossible to do that to another human being, because now you're doing it to yourself. And that's what the literal definition of compassion is. Compassion means suffering with, or literally being able to be in the very center of that spirit place that that person is at, and being able to feel everything that they're feeling. And if this gentleman, Captain Pratt or whoever, were to be able to feel the fear that the little girl was feeling at the moment he walked in the room, there's no way he could have done that, because he would have been suffering with her. But since she was separate from him, he was able to objectify her and dehumanize her, and then it would be just a matter of moving an object. Then it's not anything. He's just moving this object. So the little finger became just an objective to be able to make her into whatever he thought she should be. And that's kind of the twisted psychology that goes with that. And it's really important that we try to get into that as much as possible so that we can understand how these things are actually possible. And they're happening all over the world now, where people of their own country are abusing and killing people from their own country, like Iran, for instance. And these are the holy people that are sanctioning this. So what has happened even to the holy people of the world? They themselves have been bitten by the vampire generations ago. So now even our sacred altars in a lot of the religious traditions have historical trauma. And so it's real difficult for us to go sometimes to these holy beings of different religions and ask for help, because they themselves are contaminated with vampire's poison. And also one of the teachings that I want to be able to leave here today is that whenever this injury happens, at the moment that it happens, the natural law, because remember, nothing is separate, right within the injury itself is the medicine. So healing is within this darkness of the trauma itself. And a whole Western tradition has been set on that. It's called Christianity. That out of that darkness of the soul of the crucifixion comes a healing and salvation for all human beings. And so it is part of the natural law. It's just that we need to become aware of it. And if the perpetrator were to know that, then he wouldn't be a perpetrator. You say, well, now that I'm going to assault this person, I have the medicine in me to also make them well. That just wouldn't work. See, the perpetrator is completely unconscious of the sacredness of who they are. And all of us come from the same source. And all of us have a spark of the sacred in us. And it doesn't matter who you are or what you do. And it's that spark of the sacred that is continuously trying to move us back to that place. So in the spirit of compassion, we're healing, well, actually 14 generations, because 7 before, 7 after. But in releasing our ancestors, like some of the innocent ones that were buried there at Carlisle, and releasing the spirit of that person, we're also releasing the spirit of the perpetrator that put her there. All that needs to happen now is for the perpetrator to understand that and to take back their spirit. Because whenever you do something that heinous, an act that is so evil, your spirit literally is gone. You are no longer a human being. And in most tribes, the identity of most tribal people is that as a human being. And it's not easy to be one of those. A lot of people think, well, I'm a Homo sapiens, and scientifically my DNA says such and such, I'm a human being. It's not like that. Human being has to do with all of the values that were talked about this morning, about respect, integrity, love, compassion. Those are what make a complete human being. And I must admit, I'm still working on becoming a human being myself, because it's not an easy thing to do. It's real easy to be a Homo sapiens, but it's really difficult to be a human being, any more than it's real easy to be a Christian, but it's really hard to be Christ-like. To me, it's virtually impossible to be Christ-like. And that's why I think Friedrich Nietzsche said, the last real Christian died on a cross. And so before I stop, because I know I'm, time is a little bit limited today, I really, forgiveness itself, since everything else is a spiritual entity, forgiveness itself is a spiritual entity. And in this way, what we're doing is we're inviting this entity that is God itself. It's a part of God, the spirit of forgiveness, inviting it into the sacred hall and to passing it on to all of the directions not just in this realm, but all over the planet, because this air in which we're talking in, this very same air goes all over planet Earth. So everything that we're doing here, everything that we're saying here, this air has consciousness, this air has a spirit. So the spirit of air is taking it all over the planet, and it's going to impact, maybe not this very second, but generations from now, it'll happen just like 8, 10 generations ago, our ancestors prayed for us. And even before that, everybody that's here participating in this, I really believe that somewhere in that spirit realm, we all got together and we decided that we're going to be here today to do this. And so this is a fulfillment of a commitment that we made way, way, way back in time before anything was. And we agreed with Creator that we would be here in this sacred hall today to bring the spirit of forgiveness in a very real way, in a real understanding, back to the very center of what this society is about. I mean, I still can't even believe it. I'm in Washington, D.C., and I think the president is just a few blocks that way or that way, and it's like, I'm having a hard time wrapping my head around that. And it's like, what does this mean? Because I'm not supposed to be here. And so I hope that some of this will make intuitive sense, and if it doesn't, it's okay. Your spirit understands it. And when my teacher was telling me these things way back when, most of the time I would leave the room really angry and wondering, what is he talking about? Because he would say things like in Zen koans, and then he would laugh at me. See, at least I'm not laughing at anybody. And I would leave pretty offended almost every time for 3 years. But I would keep going back, and I don't know why I kept going back. And actually, I need to tell the story, because June 21st just happened. And after 3 years of getting these teachings from him that I had no idea what he was talking about, on June 19th of that year, I went to see him, and he was sitting in front of his little wooden house in his wheelchair because he was paralyzed. And he proceeded to lecture me like a college professor. And I was like, I even got more resentful. I said, well, why couldn't he do that the whole 3 years I've been seeing him? Why is he waiting 3 years of torture to be telling me this? And there was a reason for that. And the reason is and was that on June 21st, he was going to go on his journey. And he knew that. And so on June 21st, which was 2 days later, the solstice, he asked one of his family members there to bring in his altar. And when they brought in his altar, he said a prayer, and he expelled his consciousness into the spirit world. And then I realized who he was. Because up to then, I thought he was some crazy old guy that was just telling me real crazy stuff. But at that time, at that moment, I realized that this is truly a holy person that you've been talking to for 3 years, except that holy people usually don't tell you they're holy. Because if they do, then they might not be so holy. And so, I just want to end this with a poem by Mary Oliver. And first, is there anything that really didn't make sense and I need to say about another sentence on? Because I don't want to leave here and then somebody say, oh man, I should have said, anybody want to, so everything's cool, okay. And the name of the poem is Wild Geese. And it's pretty profound words. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over announcing your place in the family of things. And in that spirit, as a lot of our prayers, and because everything we're doing is a prayer. Actually, life itself is a prayer. I want to tell you that. Just want to say that may the sacred be restored in beauty. 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 All are my relatives, so I hope. Misfit, you know, the situation just doesn't fit. And as I was hearing about the boarding school, the chopping off the fingers, that really grabs the heart. And one of the first instincts in the human heart is to react to that. And a lot of times the reaction is we get upset and angry, and a lot of times that sticks to us. But as I was seeing the pictures of our youngsters there at the boarding school, there's already several levels of trauma that they were carrying with them, and this is one of the crucial things that I hope you know I can leave with you today, is that we have found, you know, and this has actually been researched now by researchers. So now that empirical studies have been done, people believe it's real. We knew it was real before the studies were done. And what historical trauma or soul wounding teaches us is that when you're wounded, when you're hurt, if you don't heal that wound or that hurt, suicidality, and the physical problems, the diabetes, and all of that. And so I asked the most, usually I do my work by just asking the simplest questions that I can ask, and most of the time it's either why or what is the problem. And at that time they said some words that were really didn't mean a whole lot to me, because they're not in the mainstream of psychological thinking. And they said, our problem is that our soul has been wounded. And other people say our spirit has been wounded, and that is the problem here. And of course, you know, going into the psychological literature and all of that, and realizing that the word soul and spirit really doesn't exist within the context of the, you know, Western medical models of healing. And also what is really interesting is that most Native people are stuck in having to utilize those models of healing, the Western medical model. And so there's a real trespasses as we are forgiven. And I thought as many times as that prayer has gone through all levels of our culture in the world, it really is real. It was really meant to be taken literally. And so to forgive, and what does that actually mean? But first I want to talk a little bit about this word trauma. And early on when I first started doing my work, and it was actually in Central Valley, California, as a graduate student, and my assignment was to develop a needs assessment for the particular tribes that I was working with. And I started doing that, accumulating all this data as to what's wrong and what's ailing the communities. And when I started kind of writing this stuff up, some of the older people in the community took me aside and they said, well, none of that is real, none of that is true. And at that time I thought, well, there must be a real denial system in this community, because I could see with my own eyes that there was a lot of problems. And it's the usual problems that Brother Don and other people have mentioned this morning, the problems of violence, anger, alcoholism. I was very fortunate during my training as a psychologist that I also had a native teacher that took me aside And it's through those teachings that I was able to get a little bit of a glimpse into some of the natural law and some of the mystery that underlines all the things that we're talking about. And I'm really surprised to be here, because as of last Saturday evening, I didn't even know I was going to be here. And I was called, and here I am. And for forgiveness, that's not something that that comes easy to me or to most human beings, I don't think. And as I was kind of contemplating on the meaning of that, one of the first things that came to mind is something that a very powerful medicine man said about 2,500 years ago, and his name is Yeshua, and most of you know him as Jesus Christ. And he taught his followers to forgive healing of the soul. I'll also identify with my spiritual name, Teoshpai wo Apia. And that way, all of the ancestors that are here recognize me and the words and all that's happening here. As I was listening to all the relatives this morning, I thought, this is a pretty incredible story of survival. And over the many years that I've been doing work as a clinical psychologist in Indian country, I've heard a lot of these stories a lot, and I tell people don't come to me usually to tell me how wonderful their life has been. Usually it's to tell me the terrible things that have happened. And during that time, I was able to learn a little bit about what's going on. And